Hello and welcome to Insight Indonesia, brought to you by the Jakarta Globe. I'm your host, Lynn Newman. Today we're talking about US-Indonesian relations with a distinguished ex-diplomat from the United States, David Merrill, who's the president of the US-Indo Society, the US-Indonesian Society. David has been a ambassador to Bangladesh, has served in Thailand, Burma, Cambodia, the Philippines, and was USAID director in Indonesia at one time, and so brings a wealth of experience to his new work as president of the US-Indo Society. David?
Thank you, Lynn.
Welcome to Insight Indonesia.
Delighted
nice
to
to
be
have
here.
you here. Let's start by just telling us what the US-Indo Society is. What's the history? What does it do?
US-Indo was created in 1994 by a group of Americans and Indonesians who believed that Indonesia was not sufficiently understood or appreciated in the United States. And that's still the case today, although it's less the case than it was in 1994. For such a large and important country, really the size of the United States from east to west, with 240 million people, it's surprising how little is known about Indonesia by Americans. Of course, the election of Barack Obama has improved that somewhat, but still there's a deficit in the understanding of Indonesia by Americans. So we were primarily formed to fill that gap.
Why do you think that is? Because it's always kind of been confusing to me as well, that here's this amazing country, very important, and has been important, key player for a long time, and almost invisible in the United States until maybe just recently.
Well, we'd have to just speculate on that, but I guess one reason would be the distance from the United States. The other point to make here is it wasn't always that way. In 1965 or so, when Sukarno was president, the word Sukarno in Indonesia was on the lips of taxi drivers all over New York and Washington. Indonesia was very much in the public eye, and somehow, since that time, the day-to-day knowledge about Indonesia has lessened. And so we're trying to make sure that Americans understand about Indonesia. That was the original motivation for the establishment of US-Indo. But since that time, we've evolved and added new themes. Obviously, it occurred to people that Indonesians would also like to understand something about the United States, and although they're more aware of the United States' existence than Americans are of Indonesia, but still there are many aspects about America that Indonesians thirst to know, such as about our elections and so forth. So we aim to provide that information.
They probably know too much about our Hollywood movies and TV shows already.
They do. We'd like them to know more about our Hollywood movies.
less about Katy Perry and more about good other stuff.
I understand our movies are quite popular here.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Yeah,
of course.
But
they're released here actually before they're released in the United States sometimes in pirated form.
That's one of the ways that we provide information about the United States. But we have programs almost monthly, sometimes more than monthly, in Washington, mainly about Indonesia topics. Usually that's politics. There's intense interest in the run-up to the 2014 elections, for example. We've had many speakers on that. The Indonesian economy needs to be better understood. And most Americans are stunned to find out that at a period when the United States growth is in serious difficulty, Indonesia is growing at 6–7% a year on average every year for the last 10 years, and continues to do that. In fact, Indonesia is, I think, third after China and India in terms of its economic growth rate. So these are the kind of things that Americans need to understand, on top of which most Americans don't really see that it's possible to have a Muslim-majority country that's a democracy and that still has a stunning rate of economic growth. You don't see those three things together in one country very much. Maybe Turkey is another example, but there are very few examples around the world where all that coexist.
Where all that comes together, and comes together in Indonesia in a way that needs to be better understood. And of course, as we have, one of the things we've talked about is education. And US-Indo is very involved in the comprehensive partnership arrangement between the United States and Indonesia. And that a big part of that is education, and I know that's something that's a passion for you. Tell us a little bit about what US-Indo is doing in education.
Sure. Let me say first that in addition to exchanging information about the two countries, we strive to build better relationships between the two countries. And of course, that can be done through government exchange programs. But we find that the really best way to increase understanding of the United States among Indonesians is when Indonesians have a graduate education or an undergraduate education in the United States and then return home.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not just making this up. I mean, there's a huge and rich historical record starting in the 50s and 60s when a group of economists, later known as the Berkeley Mafia.
Berkeley Mafia, sure.
Went to Berkeley and I guess other universities, came back and rose to positions of prominence in the Indonesian government. In fact, for many years, probably half or more than half of the Indonesian cabinet had a U.S. education. Mm-hmm. That's no longer true. Now, why is that important? Well, for one thing, we think a U.S. education is the best or one of the very best in the world technically. Mm-hmm. And Indonesians, I might add, when they get a U.S. education, we just had, for example, Sri Mulyani speak at UC Washington. She's a perfect example of a more recent mm-hmm. vintage. It's not only that they learn about economics, but they learn about what parts of it to take back to Indonesia, to apply to Indonesia, and what parts to leave aside. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And they've applied the parts that they need to apply for the development of their own country. And so for 30 years, the development of Indonesia, including during the Suharto period, was wisely managed from an economic standpoint by the so-called technocrats. And secondly, in addition to their technical knowledge, the fact that they understood the United States and the way Americans think was very important, because there always will be rough patches in the relationship.
Sure.
And if you've been educated in the United States, you understand Americans. Take, for example, the recent problem with WikiLeaks. Well, that was very unfortunate. But
and embarrassing.
And embarrassing. But if you've been educated in the United States, you can understand that America cannot control these things.
Right.
These things sometimes happen. Nothing was intended by that. It helps smoothen the relationship.
Oh, and people will say, well, that's just the way you Americans are. You talk like that, and you let this information leaks out, and people can roll with that punch a little bit better if they've spent time in the United States. We're going to take a break here. When we come back, we'll talk about what some of the initiatives are right now in education, and perhaps how even you or your kids can take advantage of some of these opportunities. You're watching Insight Indonesia, brought to you by the Jakarta Globe. Stay with us.